Okay, so let's get started. Um, Wonder where everybody else is. That's interesting. Am I on the right? I think I'm on the right link. Okay. All right, so let's get started. Asiyat mirpeset shetifsol sukato shel hadayar lamata. So we started this shaila yesterday. We just looked at the shaila. Um, so the question basically that the person is asking is like this. My downstairs, we live in a duplex, let's say, and my downstairs neighbor has expanded his uh, outdoor space and done some renovation to his house. And I gave him permission. Yeah, I told him initially, sure, go ahead, do whatever you need to do, and you'll have more space for your sukkah. No problem. And then I decided, well, I like his floor plan. I'd like to duplicate that on the second floor, but now it's going to intrude in his sukkah space and only allow him to have a minimal sukkah instead of the sukkah that he had planned from before. So am I doing anything wrong? Okay. So Kasav Maran b'Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows: Adam shegar b'komash shniya v'hotzi ziz al chatzer chavero. If a person lives on the second floor and builds a beam that protrudes out of his structure and it goes into the airspace of his friend's courtyard, Zacha ba'avir hazeh. That airspace he has by rights. V'lo yachol hashachen mitachtav livnot tachat haziz ulevatelo et hashimush baziz. And his neighbor therefore does not have the right. It's really a question of airspace, of air rights. His neighbor beneath him does not have the right to build something underneath that beam that would prevent the usage or, for whatever reason, inhibit the use of that beam. Ulefize. Now, of course, we have to understand what air rights pre-existed, what is written in the contract, what is written in the deed. All of these things have to be taken a look into. But the Shulchan Aruch we're just looking at one little snapshot of a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch that says that under normal circumstances, once I've already established ownership of the airspace above my friend's spot, my friend does not have the right to inhibit the use of that airspace. Adam shehechzik besukkah tachat avir chavero. So according to this, if a person has already established usage and ownership of the airspace in a certain area, and it's under your airspace, v'chaver hiskim o shelo asamecha, and the person on the second floor has not protested or has given express permission, either one. Zacha hatachton ba'avir hazeh, the ha'elyon lo yachol livnot. And so then the downstairs fellow, has attained the rights of using that airspace just by getting the consent of the upstairs neighbor. And therefore, the upstairs neighbor has no right to do anything to build that me'al hamakom haro'ei l'sukkah, above the area that's now usable for a sukkah, ve'eno rishai levatel et tashmish hasukkah shehechazik baha tachton, and does not have the right to build anything that would cause a stoppage of use of the downstairs fellow's sukkah. So the makor, the footnote, in trying to understand the source for this halacha, he says, Lichora yesh la'ayin. He says, we have to really look at this a little bit more carefully. The b'shulchan aruch sham arisham avatel mimenu et kol tashmish aziz. He says, in the case of the Shulchan Aruch, I built a beam that protrudes from my house. I've been using it, let's say, for years. And maybe my use is I use it as a clothesline or something like that to hang things. Okay. And then my neighbor wants to put something up that's going to inhibit the use of that beam. But Masha Einkein Benidon Didan Rak Tinsayim et Makom Haro'eh L'Sukkah Avalo Bitel Mimenu Tatashmish Lagamri. But in the question that's being raised here, all the upstairs neighbor is seeking to do is to diminish the use of the neighbor downstairs. He's not completely eliminating his use. He's reducing it, let's say, by 50%. So he used to have, because of his expansion project, he used to be able to have a 10 by 20 sukkah. Now he's only going to be able to have a 10 by 10 sukkah. Maybe, I don't know. But the question that he's raising is the Shulchan Aruch, does the Shulchan Aruch's halacha apply even when you're merely compromising or diminishing your neighbor's use? Or is it if you're only when you're completely eliminating it that you're not permitted to? He says, Va'ayin betaz shekotav da'azlinan batar tashmish haragil. He says, the Taz says that if you're inhibiting in any way his normal use, okay, so that word normal could mean that if you're diminishing in any way, then you're liable. Amnam gam lefi dvarav tzarich iyan haymazlinan batar tashmisho haragil she'oseh kol shana o batar tashmish haragil ba'olam. But what is considered normal use? Could you say that, well, I'm not taking away a sukkah from you. You just, since when do you need such a big sukkah? Does a person have a right to make that? Yeah. Does the person have a right to say to a guy downstairs, you don't need such a big sukkah? I want to be able to expand the use of my upstairs residence. And, I appreciate the fact that 8 days or 7 days out of the year, you want to have a nice place for your sukkah. But I want to be able for the rest of the year to be able to expand the use of my home. Yeah. But Rav Sharaga does not accept that. He feels that once the downstairs neighbor has established use, then you don't have a right to infringe on his established use. You gave him permission. You didn't protest. Now you've had a change of heart. He's already acquired those air rights, and maybe you could come to some compromise. Maybe you could compensate him for the loss of his air use, right? But you have to come up with some a deal. But then he asks the question, how long does the fellow downstairs, how long does he need in order to establish air rights? In other words, does it happen instantaneously because I gave him permission? Or does he have to have maintained it for a certain amount of time in order for it to be considered his? L'das harambam b'Shulchan Aruch hi la'alter. So according to the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, it's immediate. As soon as he's gained permission or the upstairs neighbor has not protested, then he gains the right immediately. Sheberega shehitbarer hezeko v'lo macha zacha b'zchus hazu miyad. So he says, because the moment that the upstairs neighbor recognizes the potential for his own restriction or his own, let's say, he calls it damage, really, and he doesn't say anything, so the downstairs neighbor is zoche right away. V'das harash v'chein pasuk harama tzarich chazakas shalosh shanim. But the Rush and the Ramah disagree, and they say no. You need 3 years of an establishment of demonstration, which is what the amount of time for a chazaka is. You need to establish that this has been going on for 3 years because, maybe the guy, I think the argument would be this. Maybe the guy didn't say anything because, he didn't really see what was going on. He didn't appreciate the nature of the intrusion or the restriction that was going to be placed upon it. But he says, "Aval b'mikreh hazeh shahita haskama." But in this situation, where the downstairs neighbor said, "Look, I'm planning to expand, to do some renovation. My idea is to create a patio that's so big that I'll be able to have a 10 by 20 sukkah, and I just want to make sure you're okay with it." And the guy says, "Sure, go right ahead." So in that situation where the upstairs neighbor gave not just tacit approval, but express approval, Zacha hadayer shebekoma rishana ba'avir shetachtav miyad. So then the downstairs neighbor has acquired the air rights immediately. And even though the upstairs neighbor has remorse now, because he realizes, hey, this guy did such a good job with his renovation, I could duplicate it upstairs. It's too late now. It's too late. Now, let's see what he says in the footnote. Yeah. It's a good question whether it matters whether one is a tenant and one is a landlord. I think that it depends on the nature of the contract. A tenant has rights, even though he's not the owner. He has the same rights as the owner does, usually. Um, but it all depends on, yeah, it depends. That's not necessarily so. I mean, let's say I'm renting a villa on the French Riviera, okay? And the whole reason I'm paying $10,000 a day or whatever, whatever I'm paying is because I want the view. And then all of a sudden, the neighbor downstairs decides that he's going to start a construction project and blocks my whole view. Of course, I have rights just because, even though I'm just a tenant. Yeah, I have air rights as well. So it all depends on the nature of the contract. Now, and ultimately, the issue though is who's the litigant, like who's the plaintiff in that kind of situation? Is it the tenant or is it the owner of the unit, who really has to defend the rights of his tenant, right? That, yeah.
But the tenant doesn't have the authority to approve. Let's say the downstairs neighbor say, "I want to expand." The tenant can say, "Yes, go ahead," because
The tenant doesn't have that right.
Right.
The tenant would say, "I have to check with the landlord. Yeah, it's not up to me." Right. I think I would agree with that as well. Okay. So then he continues in the tshuva, and he says, "Uchein zemuva b'shut maharas hason b'inyan adam sheyesh lo mitkan liyibush kvisa shehu tzarich et or hashemesh." So there is a tshuva. I don't know. This is a Sephardi posek, and that's why I'm not as familiar with it. There was a man who has a mitkan liyibush kvisa, some kind of contraption for drying of clothes, air drying the clothes on the mirpeset, right? It's probably a series of clotheslines that he has. Shehu tzarichet or hashemesh, that needs the sun, needs the sunlight in order to dry the clothes. V'chavero rotzeh livnot mimulo b'makom shemonea mimenu al yidei habniya et kinisat or hashemesh. He says his friend now wants to build something, a neighbor of his wants to build something that'll be opposite the place where he normally dries his clothes, that's going to block the sunlight. Okay? I can no longer use that space for drying my clothes. And he paskins that even though the neighbor is distancing his construction project, the Dalit Amos that is required by our sages, nonetheless, Kaven Shesof Sof Moneh Mimenu Tashemesh Miyuad Liyibush HaKfisa. But since at the end of the day he is preventing his friend from the regular use that he had already established in his living space, right, to be able to have sunlight for a certain amount of hours a day, and now I'm going to get none, you don't have the right to block my sunlight. Please don't take my sunshine away. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so 1 second. Let's see. Let's see. So he quotes other tshuvas. Okay. He also brings from Rav Sharaga as well, or maybe he's, yeah. Shehela de'en livnot mirpeset v'lifsolet makom hasukah shel hatachton. That you're not allowed to build a mirpeset if it's going to block the sukkah of the downstairs neighbor. He says that's actually usually in the contract of any resident of an apartment building, that you don't have a right to modify your balcony such that it could in any way compromise use either of a sukkah or sunlight or whatever it is of any other neighbor. Okay. Okay. Now, v'im kain. So if so, this being the case, hu hadin kan, shabal hakoma harishona hechzik b'makom hasukkah. This is the same thing, therefore, would be true. In a situation where a person has already established the use of his sukkah on downstairs, has already gotten permission, even though you could argue that al pidin, he'd be allowed to build on the second floor. But he can't build. In other words, if the guy upstairs wants to renovate, he has every right, provided that he doesn't inhibit the use of this fellow's sukkah. Now, again, what if I just, through my renovation, I'm only inhibiting your use? Let's say you're now going to have 80% of the use of the airspace, 90% of the use. Do you have a right to stop me for that small amount of use? That's where probably a Beis Din would want to try and work out some kind of compromise. Pay the guy $1,000 for the inconvenience of the 10% of his airspace not being usable. But reasonable people will be able to come up with some kind of compromise.
You can't just presume we're all part of it.
That's right. Yeah. The Sefer Pischei Choshen, which we've made reference before from Rav Bloy, he has a similar shaila, but there's a little twist over there. There's a fellow on the downstairs, the downstairs neighbor has already established a chazaka to build his sukkah on property that doesn't belong to him. It's, let's say he builds his sukkah every year on the sidewalk. So it's a Rishus Harabim. But no one's bothered him for years. And they understand that's because it's sukkahs, they walk around. Okay, for those 7 days, they'll walk around. Okay, his neighbor upstairs wants to build a mirpeset right over that spot on the sidewalk. So the question now is, does the downstairs neighbor have a right to prevent him, since he's been building his sukkah on a property that doesn't even belong to him? Okay. And I'm saying, if you want, we could take a look at that one as well. I don't have it with me, but if you want, I can prepare the tshuva for tomorrow. We can take it. It seems like an interesting shaila. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Nobody complains.
Yeah, no one has complained to the city for years.
No, I'm saying, cool. It's only there for 10 days, so like everybody's okay with it.
So does that mean your structure only has to be out there for 10 days? Your structure is going to be permanent.
No comment. Wait until tomorrow.
Yeah, it's not, you don't know about, it's been living in water range, whatever, 20 years,
20.
20 years. It has to be uninterrupted, open, they're there, people can see them, the owner could see them, maybe they didn't, whatever. They squat for 20 years, is the right. Oh,
Yeah. Okay, so maybe I'll print out, if I remember for tomorrow, I'll print out that tshuva. Yeah. Okay. And we're all going to be there eventually, so we might as well find out now. Yeah. Yeah, the People's Court.
Second seal story, and the guy says, I want it down. He says, you're right, it'll come down and give him 8 days to take it down.
Yeah. Okay. The next tshuva. Liftoach chalon bechorer keshekar la'acherim. Okay. Opening the window in the winter when other people are cold. Who has rights? You're in an office building or any place that is shared by a group of individuals. You're in the base medrash, you're in your office, you're on a bus, and the question is, you won't want to open the window. Guy says it's cold, it's in the middle of the winter. I don't want the window open. I'm going to catch a cold. Who has the rights and who loses the rights? So the she'ela is as follows. And of course, anytime Jews get together, they're going to figure out reasons to disagree, right? So if it's either going to be over land rights or it's going to be it's too cold or it's too hot. It's like the air conditioning in the shul. Nobody's happy. Okay. Lamadnu beveis hamedrash umezik ha'avir b'chutz hayakar. We were studying in the base medrash. The temperature in the room was cold. But there were a number of people who felt that it was too warm. They wanted to open the window. And were other people who were cold and they wanted the window to remain closed. Who has to give in to whom? Like whose rights prevail in that kind of situation? And does it matter whether it's winter or summer? Okay. Okay, so here's the tshuva. Kasav Moran b'Shulchan Aruch sha'adam shehechzik lasos melacha b'makomo v'hamelacha hazu goremes sheyavo orvim v'heimafriim l'shchenim b'koilam b'tzif tzufam. So the Shulchan Aruch addresses the following case. A person has a certain kind of work, but that work attracts the crows. And the crows come, maybe he's like working with raw meat or who knows what it is. And, or he's got some kind of food preparation business. The crows come, they're bothering the neighbors with their caw and O shehem yoshvim al ha'ilanos u'machalam esaperos, or they come and they rest on the adjoining trees, and they're pecking away at the produce that belongs to the neighbors who are growing fruit. Imhaya hashachena adam kapdan o choleh shahatziftzuf shel ha'orvim mafriim lo So if one of the neighbors is truly disturbed by it, especially if if his claim is that these birds are affecting my health because I can't rest during the day and I have a certain health condition and I need to rest. Chayev levatel es hamalacha, o sheyishmor merchak shelo yazik et chavero, velo shayach bazeh chazaka. So then the person who's with that business that's attracting the crows has to stop the work or distance the work to a significant amount such that it will no longer affect the neighbor. And you can't say, I have a chazaka. Because if a person says, I'm getting damaged by what you're doing, even your chazaka is not of help.
You have a landowner, you have an adjacent adjoining landowner, or a neighbor, and you've got, for example, tannery and smells, or you've got noise or vibrations or water or something escapes from the land. That's called nuisance.
Yeah.
So the use has to be unreasonable.
That's right. And that's true, even if you've been doing it for years and the old neighbors never protested. Because a new neighbor could come in and he says, I can't live this way. So the guy says, well, too bad. You should have known when you moved in here that this was what I do. What, all right, but the question is, within, there has to be some sort of land use establishment. What if a person has a license to operate a factory? I can't build my cottage right next to a guy's factory and say, shut down your factory, right? So obviously and I guess it all depends on the use of the normative use of the property. But anyway, let's continue this. He says, "V'harama sham hosif shalav dafka orvim elakol nezek gadol." The Rama adds that it doesn't specifically have to be crows; it could be any kind of damage. Sha'adam lo yachol l'sov lo that a normal person can't tolerate it. Alav l'salik esahezek limno et sar mechavera. So there's an obligation to remove the damage to prevent pain and suffering from a neighbor. Lefizeh. So according to this, ein safek shebechorev rov b'nei adam heim regishim lekor. He says there's no doubt that during the winter, most people are sensitive to cold. Okay, upetichat hachalon mazika lahem mipnei hatzina. And opening a window in the winter is considered injurious to people because they're going to catch cold. He says, and in general, people are considered to be fastidious in their disposition when it comes to catching cold, when it comes to the cold. Anyone who wants to change the norm, which is that people generally want their windows closed in the winter, is considered to be a mazik, a damager. And therefore the majority who would normally want the windows closed in the winter have a right to close the window. And then he says, V'huadin conversely, Bekayetz, Sharov Hatzibor Cham Lahem, when most people are warm, Uzukukim la'avir tzach lahakel me'aleim et hachom, and they need some fresh air to help, they need a little breeze from outside to alleviate the warmth. V'rotzim lifto et hachalom, v'yesh anashim shekar lehem. And yet there's some, let's say, a lot of times older people are very sensitive to even a minor breeze because they say it's too cold for me. Right? Whereas, but you have to go with the majority. So if the majority want the window open in the summer, right? So they have the right to open the window. He says, and even though there are people who may be cold or may be warm, they don't have an opportunity, they don't have the right to stop people from doing the normative thing, which is to keep the window closed in the winter and to keep the window open during the summer. Lama hadavar domeh. Okay, and we'll hold it here. We'll continue in Mirtz Hashem tomorrow.